Well, people are starting to become much more concerned that if we carry on as we are with climate change, we're in danger of destroying our civilization. And quite often on social media, you'll see posts like, we shall run out of food, there'll be riots, there'll be dead people in the supermarket car park. But society's collapsed in a much more complex, much more fascinating way than that. So I've made a couple of videos already about climate change. And in this one, I'm going to look at what it's like to be living in a society that's collapsing. To be clear, I'm not saying that society is going to collapse. I'm just trying to understand what it would be like if it did. But I think I ought to point out, when it comes to our CO2 emissions, we're on the worst track possible. And some people are saying, if we haven't already passed the tipping points of no return, we're about to any moment, so certainly it's very serious. If you haven't got time to watch the whole video, I can sum it up quite easily by saying, if I've got something here, the human race has been around for 300,000 years. We've only had farming for 12,000 years, civilization for 6,000 years, and the Industrial Revolution for 250 years. So human beings are perfectly well adapted to suffering, to hunger, to living in a world of conflict. You might not like it, but when the time comes, your DNA will know what to do. The good people died first. Those who refused to steal or prostitute themselves died. Those who gave food to others died. Those who refused to eat corpses died. Those who refused to kill their fellow man died. Parents who resisted cannibalism died before their children did. I think this is going to be a jolly video. The first part's easy to predict. We just carry on as we are. That's easy because that's how we always tackle climate change. We never do enough. But as climate change progresses, our lives will gradually become more difficult. More difficult for businesses to manufacture things, more difficult to transport goods, more difficult for us to travel. Our homes will be less comfortable to live in, be more difficult to grow food. Everyone gets very concerned about running out of food, but really food is a commodity. You can ship it all around the world. As long as your country is wealthy enough, you normally always be able to have food. The thing that really is a problem is running out of water. Water is very heavy, you need an awful lot of it. You can't really ship it long distances. So I think that's the way most societies will start to suffer. And to show that, I've got an example from North Mexico where 23 million people are using reservoirs that are dangerously low. And in one of the cities there, Monterrey, things are so bad, the houses no longer have running water, but they have to have it delivered by tankers. The water is too dirty to drink, so you have to buy bottled water if you can afford it, otherwise you have to drink the dirty water. Water is so precious there now that the reservoirs have to be guarded by armed police. And you might be thinking, well, obviously there should be riots, they're running out of water, 23 million people. Well, really, if you run out of water, you have to move, you can't live without water. And the amount of water we drink is very small compared to what our society needs, so maybe it's something like 0.4% of all the water our economy needs goes to drinking water. A much bigger problem, you can buy bottled water, a much bigger problem is if you don't have enough water to flush the toilet. Half the world's population lives in urban areas. Can you imagine a city without flushing toilets? Here is how the locals are responding. The Alliance of Users of Public Services, a public interest group, regularly protests outside government buildings. They allege that local leaders are directly profiting from drinks companies' water use. Even though there's not enough water in the public reservoirs for the public, Coca-Cola and Heineken are still drawing water for their businesses. On the part of local and state government, there is a crisis of ineptitude, and they blame everyone but themselves. The Alliance is calling for removal of Monterrey's Director of Water and Drainage due to his conflicts of interest. His family, which is among Mexico's wealthiest, founded one of Coca-Cola's bottlers, Arca Continental. When the stresses on society that come from running out of water, running out of food, it seems to me people are much more concerned about incompetent governments or injustice. And in this case, I think the richer neighbourhoods get more water per person than the poorer ones, so I think they're right to be concerned about that. So it's easy to say, well, you run out of water and then you can always move. There's lots of people out here. It's Saturday morning. You run out of water, you can easily move. That's much more difficult. It's much more difficult than you might think. Here's something about someone who lives near Lake Chad. Lake Chad has shrunk by 95% due to climate change, and this is what's happened to her village. Hawakali was displaced twice in only 7 months. Conflict and climate change are making it hard for people in Lake Chad to find a safe place where food is not a constant worry. We left our village because we were scared that Boko Haram would raid it and kill us. We are almost 40 people, grandparents, children and in-laws. We walked for 10 days until we reached Kaya. Last week we were forced to leave Kaya too because we had nothing to eat. We lost our harvest due to floods. You can move when you run out of water, but you lose everything. Well, go back to North Mexico. On the other side of the border, South Texas, there are 3 million people there, and they'll have to move if there aren't rains this year. Well, 3 million people can find somewhere to live in the United States. You know, it's a wealthy country, would look after them. Mexico, 23 million people running out of water. Where will they go? So, if your society fails early on in the collapse, at least you can move to somewhere else later on, as we'll see later in the video. That's not quite so practical. In Bangladesh, every year about 400,000 people lose their land due to rising sea levels. They become refugees. 70% of them end up being refugees in the cities, and they end up living in the slums. So already societies are collapsing. The people move away, and I'm guessing if you live in a slum, your family isn't going to flourish, is it? So gradually the societies go, and the people who live in them go, and they gradually decline. Well, sooner or later, as climate change makes things more difficult, the only way that we'll be able to survive, or most people will be able to survive in our countries, is if the government puts the economy on a wartime economy. And we're having a little bit of a practice like that in Europe at the moment. Because of the war in Ukraine, energy and food has become much more expensive. European governments are making sure everyone can afford energy, and there are subsidies and price caps and those sorts of things. So sooner or later we move on to a wartime economy, then things get better for a short time at least. And I'm going to explain that by using the example of Britain in the Second World War. So in the Second World War, Britain had a wartime economy. It had central planning by the government. And something very strange happened. I just have to have a rest now, I've been going up a hill. Something very strange happened. The British economy grew 21% between 1938 and 1941. This is extraordinary for Britain. That's a really high rate. If you weren't directly involved in the fighting, your life expectancy went up. Child mortality went down. There's an increase in the birth rate. The amount of land being farmed increased by 50%. And you might think, well, this is very strange, a centrally planned economy. Surely that was communism and it was a terrible disaster. In Britain there was democratic legitimacy. Everyone was on board. And it's no surprise because economists believe there's a greater economic benefit from government spending than there is from private spending. And one economist sums it up quite well, and she says everything on your mobile phone that's useful comes from government subsidies and government investment. So the internet, the World Wide Web, touch sensor screen, voice recognition, GPS, all of those things only exist because of government spending. And if you think, well, this video's turned into some sort of communist propaganda film, the United States of America had a centrally planned economy in the Second World War as well. And if you refused to cooperate with the government, they sent the army in and basically carried your managers out. So this will be something to look forward to. Well, how do they do it? Because in some ways, to go from a capitalist system to a centrally planned system is a revolution, isn't it? But they were able to do it because they had high levels of social cohesion. Everyone supported the war effort. There was a national government of a coalition. There was rationing so that everyone had enough food and no one had too much, which is why we all became healthier. There were subsidies, price caps, just like we're having now to help people survive due to the war in Ukraine. I'll just walk down this way a bit now. And we're only able to do that because everyone agreed. And one group of people who you think might not agree to having a centrally planned economy was the very wealthy. In the Second World War, the top income tax rate was 99.25%. And in fact, that carried on very high until the 50s and the 60s. The wealthy people gave up well-paid jobs to join the armed forces. And also because of rationing, they couldn't really spend any of their money anyway. And I'm bringing it up now because in the current situation, the wealthiest 1% of people in the world, their combined carbon footprint is twice that of all of the poorest 50%, half of the world's population, only produces half as much CO2 as the wealthiest 1%. So in Britain in the war, we had subsidies from 1940 to 1954, 14 years. If we're to have a survivable future, it's quite possible we'll need to have a wartime economy, maybe for decades, maybe forever. So are the wealthy going to give up their wealth? Or do you think they might not be rioting in the streets, but they've got lots of money, brings with it a lot of political influence. Do you think they might use that to try and slow things down so they can carry on living as they are? You know, in a modern world, it's easy to move from country to country. I get the impression many very wealthy people don't have a great sense of loyalty to their government, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. So we've got social tension from the poor because of injustice, social tension from the wealthy, now sooner or later, no matter how well governments perform and how just the system is and how much social cohesion there is, eventually if your society really does not have any long-term future, eventually your society will run out of food. And I'm using food to concentrate on because I think whatever the cause of the collapse, conflict or social tension or invasion or any of the other things, in the end it always breaks down to have you got enough food or not. So I'm going to use food as an example, and now you're saying yes, quite right, we'll run out of food and there'll be riots and dead people in the supermarket car parks. No, at the end of the Second World War, the Allies were very concerned that the Nazis might try and get power, and so they deliberately did not give the Germans enough to eat. 100,000 people died, most of them over the age of 70. And then when they realised the Nazis weren't coming back, they gave them enough food and things went back to normal. And the Nazis did the same thing in the Netherlands. In the hunger winter, they restricted the food the Dutch could have as sort of partly a punishment for trying to rise up against the Nazis. So if you've got a rebellious country and you want to calm them down, if reducing the amount of food they have really did cause more political tension, you wouldn't do that, but it doesn't. Reducing the amount of food people have quietens them down, makes them more compliant, because they're really after getting more food. And as I covered in a previous video, if you have a democracy, then your government will want to keep you alive because they want to get re-elected. A good way to do that is to keep your constituents alive. And some people say, the reason you don't have famines in rich countries is because you've got lots of money, not because they're democracies. But in 1981, Sudan and Ethiopia had 11% reduction in their food production. They had great famines. At the same time, Zimbabwe had a reduction of 38%, nearly getting on for half of their food production was lost. They didn't have a famine though, because Zimbabwe is a democracy. So a democracy is really good, social justice is very good. These are all important things, not to save your societies, but enable them to keep going for as long as possible. The next thing to know about famines is, when you do run out of food, is even though there's a famine, there's normally lots of food. I think we'll go up this way next. There's normally plenty of food, and the people who don't get the food are the poorest and the people with the least power. So they have to try and develop networks or contacts so they can get the food. Whereas before, in a wartime economy, it was all about cooperation and altruism and all working together. If there's not enough food, it becomes a much more competitive world. And you might think, well, if there isn't enough food to feed everyone, surely there'll be a breakdown of law and order then, because how can, if there's not enough food? But what governments do is they prioritise food for their own people, because a society only breaks down if the relationship between the government and the people breaks down. So providing the government still exists, it can still maintain law and order. It can still try and get food in the future. It can keep things going. Once civilization collapses, that's it. It's much more difficult to recover. So they can legitimately say, we're going to keep food for the people who are important for our society, and we're not going to give enough food to other people because there just isn't the food to go around. And by this time, remember, we could have been on a wartime economy for years, maybe decades. We'll have had rationing. The government will have a much bigger role in society. It will control food through your rationing. So it'd be quite easy to say to people, well, we've had to reduce your rations a bit. They won't say we're starving you to death, but we're still giving you something. So it's a time to be resilient and self-reliant if you're not one of the chosen people to get food. Here's a story about someone in Tigray, which is a province of Ethiopia. Sufan has a master's degree in project management, and before the war, the 27-year-old had a well-established career with a good salary and a plan to pursue a PhD. These days, she is selling her body to survive the hunger which claimed the life of a parent. I watched my father die from malnourishment. He died in my hands. My mother is all bones. The warehouses are full of aid, enough to feed the city. There's always plenty of food around in a famine. But people are dying, unable to receive the aid they are entitled to, because the people are weak and the government is strong. After I lost my father to starvation, I needed to do something to save my own life and my mother's. Hunger does not give you time. So economists would say this is an example of when a society breaks down, the value of everything changes. She had a good job, she's got money in the bank, she can't get money out of the bank for some reason, the banks will stop giving out money. So no matter, if you're watching this video, no matter how much money you have now, no matter how much food costs, in a crisis everything suddenly changes. So for example, in Mexico, water is now so precious, the reservoirs have to be protected by armed police. Now food is so precious in Tigray in this story, and money is so worthless, everything changes. So no matter how comfortable you might feel now, we're entering in a very dangerous situation. And in Afghanistan, if you can't sell your body, you can always sell one of your children. So many families are selling their children now. Its price used to be $2,000 a child. Now the price has plummeted because there's so many people selling them. But at least this is a good stage of the drought or the famine, because people can still you can still get food. And in fact, by selling your child, at least the new owners, the new parents, will be able to feed it. So at least things your child will be looked after. But then, as the famine develops, some famines are much worse. And I've got here some stories from the famine in Ukraine in 1933. And that was a famine partly caused by reduction in food, but mostly caused by the Soviet government wanting to punish the Ukrainian people for not wanting to have communes. The Ukrainians want to keep hold of their own land. So here's the first excerpt. A woman doctor wrote to a friend in June 1933 that she had not yet become a cannibal, but was not sure I shall not be one by the time my letter reaches you. So this is an example where the government's decided doctors and postal workers are important parts of society because they're still getting some food, And other people who aren't important have died, and so now going to be eaten by the doctor, possibly by the postal workers. By now, it's possible the people in power won't be quite so, but might not be behaving so well. Remember, in a crisis like this, it's much more difficult to hold elections, for the media to hold the government to account. If you've got food, that's power. Maybe you'll be keeping the food now, not because you want it for the good of society to keep government going, but for your friends and relatives. So, as things become more difficult, it's quite possible we lost some freedoms during the wartime economy. Maybe now we should become less free, and the government will become more of a tyranny. So the government can decide who gets food and who doesn't, but it can't easily segregate society. Already in 1932, some children had begun to swell up from hunger, and more children stopped going to school. In January 1933, 2/3 of the pupils had disappeared. The famine was in full swing. It's a very dangerous world where children cannot go about the place safely. Ask your mother if I can spend the night at your house. The terrible famine had begun, and there were cases of cannibalism. And even though you're hungry, you can't sit at home and try and conserve your energy. You have to go around the place trying to find food wherever you can, which wears you down again. The acacias were in bloom. We hunted for wild sorrel. One day we were passing by a vegetable depot when Volodka suddenly disappeared. Then I saw people chasing him. He was clever enough to steal 5 potatoes and 2 sugar beets. Once the government's decided to go down this route, they have to stick to it. The future of their society depends on it. Once you've got these rules, you have to stick to them so that everyone knows you get dire consequences if you don't. Here's a story of some children trying to scrape up some food that's been dropped on the floor at a storage depot, and the soldiers are trying to stop them. Don't you dare touch socialist property. Hungry children would throw themselves down trying to scrape up as much grain off the floor as possible. But during the battle, the children would be beaten and crushed. Weak from hunger, they never got up off the ground. Now we come back to this point I've said at the beginning about... Where's the city over there? Now we come back to this point I made at the beginning, where I said your DNA will know what to do, even if you don't. Most famines only last a year, not much longer than that. If your society can last that long, then it can recover. So in a famine, as you saw in Germany and the Netherlands, people over the age of 70 died. In the famine in 2012 in Somalia, 260,000 people died. Half of those were under the age of 5. So as long as your adults of a reproductive age can survive, then your society can carry on. It is a barbaric thing to eat your child. The woman was old, but she did eat her baby. That's how it was in 1933. It stays with you forever. It's engraved in my mind. The woman survived, but she did not live long. Can you imagine what it's like living in a society like that? Can you imagine walking past people who may be not getting as much food as you, who have collapsed? If you don't eat anything for 5 or 6 weeks, and you start, as long as you have enough to drink, then after that time you might have lost about 20% of your body weight, and then doctors would say you were at severe risk of death. But with your clothes on, you might look a bit thinner, but you would look fairly normal. You could still go about the place, even though you might collapse and die at any moment. Can you imagine that? Walking past people who are desperate for help. So after a year, it's possible things will recover, food will come back. And even if your society is eventually destined to collapse, remember, the things that will affect it will be extreme weather events or economic shocks from other parts of the world. So you might have a famine and then have another 5 years, which will be okay. But as things get worse, these shocks will happen more often, and in the end, a collapse will come. might be thinking, well, thank God for that. We've been listening to all the Count Everything videos about climate change, and we finally got to the time when the collapse happens. But what finally causes the collapse then? Well, I've made a list of things. So far I said most famines only last a year or more, or slightly more. If a famine lasts longer, it's much more damaging. So for example, in 1315 in Northern Europe, they had 3 years of winter. Some people think it was to do with a volcano going off somewhere in the world, but anyway, they had 3 years of winter. The first year, they had the normal famine, all the old and young people died. And, true to form, only the king and the aristocracy and the clergy were allowed access to the official food stores. Remember, governments always prioritise themselves so they can keep society going. The second year, when they still didn't have any food, they ate all the food they were keeping for seed to plant for the next harvest, and they ate all the animals that would normally do the work around the farm, or they would have bred from, or maybe used for wool, for sheep they would have used for wool. So the longer it went on, just the more difficult it became to recover. And in fact, there are still some places in France that have never recovered, they've just been abandoned. So the longer the famine goes on, and why might the famine go on? Because the climate has changed. Because maybe there's been a collapse of industry, you can't get enough fertiliser or chemicals or machinery for your farming. Maybe a famine caused industry to grind to a halt, and now the industry causes, it's like a vicious circle, so the industry causes another famine and things get worse and worse. That's the first one. Also, in the famine in Ukraine, even though it sounds like hell on earth, even in the worst parts of Ukraine, 80% of the people survived. So the Soviets, maybe they had 80% of people they looked after and 20% they were punishing. You can do that. How bad would it have to get for the government not to be able to feed so few people that they just couldn't do? They'd be outnumbered by the people they weren't able to help. So a very severe famine, possibly by climate change or a combination of factors. Also, academics believe a society can cope with one problem, like a big famine, and can recover, but it can't so easily recover from repeated famines. So if we had a famine every 5 years, say, it'd be very difficult for the country to keep going, to do any of the other things it needs to do for the societies to survive. Also, if you're one of the people who managed to survive, even though the government hadn't helped you, well, you might feel a bit resentful to the government. So you might not riot in the bad times when there's not enough food, but when things recover, maybe there'll be a large enough people who realise next time they might not survive and be much more determined not to suffer that again. Also, if the government isn't able to help enough of its own people, then maybe there'd be rebellion from within. And then injustice, incompetence, things that lead to social tension, invasion from other countries. Remember, other countries will be affected at a different rate. So they might take advantage, especially if they need more room to grow food, because their rice productions collapse, for example. However it comes, you reach a tipping point, and that tipping point causes things to collapse quite quickly. The academics have summed it up quite well. Breakdown of central authority, revolts, provinces break away, centres of power ransacked and abandoned, no law or protection. One of the problems is, as we know, however bad things are, our governments will try and keep us alive as long as possible, hopefully. So the population won't have really adapted to the new environment or what the new environment can easily support. So if there's so many of us left, we saw in that Ukraine about they were hunting for wild sorrel and things like that. In a country of 70 million people, we'd eat all the wild plants quite quickly. We'd eat all the wild animals if you could catch them, if we could work out how to catch them. probably cut down all the trees to keep warm. So there's so many of us, we would be so destructive, that would just make things worse as well. So how many people could Britain or countries like Britain support? Well, if you look at the theory of subsistence farming, with all the agricultural land we've got, maybe we could support 10 million people. And I'm going for subsistence farming because you don't rely on animals or anything else, you just produce enough food for yourself and your family. But if you look at the historic population in Britain, in medieval times, it doesn't go above 5 million or even 3 or 4 million. Medieval times was full of people who knew how to live in medieval times. It's full of farmers and carpenters and blacksmiths and stonemasons and wheelwrights and shipwrights. For the last 3,000 years in Europe, we've had an awful lot of international trade. You know, for bronze you need copper and tin, and it was brought together from distant parts of Europe and even the Middle East. In this new world where things have collapsed and it's subsistence farming, it's unlikely you'll be able to move too far because no one will have the resources to support you. And in fact, in some regions of Afghanistan now, there are some villagers who cannot go more than 3 or 4 miles from their village because they're surrounded by villages that are involved with blood feuds. Even though there's been a collapse, I'm sure there'll still be some networks going. Maybe people from the government or the armed forces will have their own local areas they'll be able to keep going. Maybe the criminal organisations have sprung up to provide food to the people who weren't being given it by the government. There will be some organisation, but the trouble is, if you only have subsistence farming, you can only grow enough food for yourself and your family, so you can't support a civilization, because a civilization needs like a hierarchy, doesn't it? If everyone's doing farming, you can't have anyone to be the king or traders or anything like that. So that's the end of societies and what it's like to live in a society that's collapsing. But we haven't really got to the end of civilization. Think of all the things humans have discovered in the last 6,000 years. The maths, the science, art, literature, religion, philosophy. How long would it take for that sum of knowledge to be lost? Because some countries are bound to be less affected by climate change and less dependent on the global economy and modern farming techniques, so they've got a better chance of surviving. How long would people in Britain, with only maybe 1 million people living in it, how long would they be able to keep the science going for? And that's some knowledge from 6,000 years of civilization. So I'm going to make another video about that, but I'm not going to do it yet because these long videos take a lot of research, a lot of work. I'm going to make some shorter ones about climate change still, but eventually I will get round to doing one about how long civilizations last for after societies have collapsed. So thank you for watching. If you think there's anything interesting in this video, please share it with other people to get the message out. And then thank you for watching. If you're still watching now, well done, and I'll see you next time.